Wow, can you believe it? It's the last day of May. June is practically here, and we're almost halfway through 2015. That said, this isn't a review episode, so let's not dwell on the past year right now. Instead, let's discuss what's been happening now, sort of. Today's story comes from a country in South America by the name of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, or as it's known more commonly, simply just Venezuela. What's happening in Venezuela, you ask? The simple answer to that question is mass political protests and anti-government demonstrations. But in order to better understand more about the situation, perhaps some background information would paint a better picture. Venezuela's history is one of back-and-forth shifts between democracy and autocracy. Since 1522 up until 1811, it was a colony under Spain, very much like almost the rest of South America. Its independence and identity as a country was not really fully established until 1830, though. The rest of the 19th century up until the mid-20th century found Venezuela often suffering from either political turmoil or some form of autocracy. Usually that autocracy had a military strongman in charge. Then, in 1945, a civilian military coup overthrew the government and ushered in a 3-year period of democratic rule. It was during these 3 years that the first free and fair elections of Venezuela occurred. In 1948, the military junta of Venezuela led a successful coup which put an end to the democratic government of Venezuela and created a dictatorship under Marcos Pérez Jiménez. Jiménez unexpectedly lost an election held by the junta in 1952, but like any ruthless dictator, he and the government just decided to ignore the results, and Jiménez served as president until 1958, when he was forced out of office in January 23 of that year by a coup. Jiménez fled to the Dominican Republic and then settled in Spain under Francisco Franco's regime, because, dictators look out for one another, apparently. It's like a fraternity. Meanwhile, back in Venezuela, unlike most of the previous coups d'etats, this one sought to preserve and consolidate a long-lasting democracy. So, to that end, the major political parties of Venezuela, except for the Communist Party, signed the Punto Fijo Pact, or, if translated to English, the Fixed Point Pact. Essentially, it was an agreement by representatives of the then 3 main political parties of Venezuela, those being the Acción Democrática, the COPEI, and the Unión Republicana Democrática, to accept the 1958 presidential election results and preserve the democracy they would create. And interestingly enough, the parties did as they promised, and Venezuela's future in terms of democratic liberties were on the upside. In 1973, when oil prices soared, Venezuela's income just went through the roof. The oil industries were nationalized in 1976 by the government, and public spending and government external debt greatly increased. Then, oil prices collapsed in the 1980s, and Venezuela's economy was crippled. The currency of Venezuela started to devalue, people began to see their standard of living fall dramatically, and times were tough. And it is normally during this time when democracy is truly tested. It's not in the good times, but rather the bad times, when you truly see whether people will stick with the liberties that they have, or if they will turn and give away those liberties to the first person promising hope. Unfortunately, Venezuela's then democratic government and its people didn't rise to the occasion, and instead fell victim to rioting on the streets, the most notable one being the, this is difficult to pronounce, Caracazo riots, I'm guessing, in 1989, which saw thousands of people killed, and there were 2 attempted and unsuccessful coups in 1992, and then in 1993, the then president of Venezuela at the time, Carlos Andrés Perez, was impeached on corruption charges. So by 1998, the Venezuelan people had lost confidence in the political parties, and given what I've said so far, who can blame them? I certainly don't, given the circumstances. Thing is, as a result of this loss of confidence, Hugo Chavez was elected as president, and almost immediately upon his election, he led what is referred to as the Bolivarian Revolution, which formed an assembly to write a new constitution of Venezuela. And aside from a two-day period in 2002, from an attempted coup, from 1999 up until his death in 2013, Chavez was in charge of Venezuela as president. Naturally, as his title of president indicates, there were elections held during his 14-year rule, and he was re-elected 3 times. Of course, the supposed fairness of those elections, given various instances of opposition movements vocally resenting his presidency sporadically occurring during those 14 years, and the numerous political tests like recall referendums and protests, it kind of puts the fairness of those elections up for debate. Regardless, we move on to the current president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro. Just to give you some backstory on Maduro, he was appointed by Hugo Chavez as vice president of Venezuela in late 2012, and while Chavez was battling with cancer, Chavez vocally endorsed Maduro as his replacement, should he not survive his cancer treatment. When the 2013 election occurred after Chavez's death, Maduro narrowly won by a margin of 1.5% against his opponent, Enrique Capriles. Capriles did not acknowledge the results of the election and demanded a recount. Maduro basically took the Marco Perez Jimenez route on that request, and didn't bother to address Capriles' demands for a recount. And aside from maybe giving the usual bureaucratic response of, we'll look into it, nothing happened. Maduro's presidency, however, has started to look less like a presidency and more so like a dictatorship, because he has, on 2 occurrences already in his just 2 years of office, requested and been granted by Venezuela's National Assembly the power to rule by decree. The majority of Maduro's presidency has essentially been rule by decree. However, it isn't the flagrant corruption of power Maduro is using that has people upset, because people don't really care who's in charge as long as things are going good for them. Problem is, things aren't going good in the country under Maduro. This brings me back to the original story of the mass anti-government demonstrations occurring in Venezuela at this time. You see, Venezuela under Maduro has been experiencing pervasive problems of shortages of basic goods, high inflation, and violent crime, and people are fed up. This protest marks almost a year since the first mass protest against Maduro's presidency and the deteriorating living conditions in Venezuela back in 2014, where quite a few demonstrators were injured, killed, or imprisoned. Time will tell how this year's demonstration goes. So what are my thoughts on this whole thing? Well, here's the gist of it. People of Venezuela, Maduro is basically Hugo Chavez 2.0, given the Chavez endorsement of Maduro in 2013 and Maduro's political background. The thing is, Maduro seems worse. At least Chavez seems to have kept up the facade of democracy and didn't have extremely notable periods of ruling by decree. Also, come on, that mustache? This guy looks like Joseph Stalin's tanned and slightly fatter brother. Look at that resemblance. People of Venezuela, honestly, if you want change for the better, you're going to have to rise up and fight for it. At the end of the day, nobody else is going to fight your battles for you, so don't wait for help from the rest of the free world. It's a sad fact, and I'm being honest here, because at a time in our world where the Islamic State is raising hell in Southwest Asia, Russia's annexing parts of neighboring countries in Europe, China is militarizing and claiming parts of seas that don't belong to them, and North Korea is ruled by an egomaniacal madman and his deceased relatives, you're kind of going to get lost in the shuffle of things. The nations of the United States of America, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Canada, you know, the former imperialist nations or colonies that now act as the beacons of Western democracy and liberty, they kind of have bigger and badder boogeymen to deal with at the moment. But I genuinely wish you good fortunes in your efforts against Maduro. As always, Sic Semper Tyrannis. Okay, changing the subject now. Let's talk internet. This is going to be a short one because anyone on the internet, aside from early users, are probably familiar with this in some way or another. Electronic spamming. Gosh, it's the worst. The most common form is email spam, but there's also instant messaging spam, web search engine spam, spam in blogs, wiki spam, online classified ads spam, mobile phone messaging spam, internet forum spam, junk, fax transmissions, social spam, file sharing spam, the list goes on. It's annoying, costs little for advertisers or anyone basically to do what with the electronic capabilities most users have at their disposal nowadays, and it's horrible. No, I'm not interested in going to your completely legitimate, but I've never heard of it before, online college. No, I'm not interested in your male enhancement drug or operation to increase the size of my erection. My reproductive organs work just fine, thank you. And for the last time, no! You're not a Nigerian prince, and I won't give you my bank account information. Leave me alone! The worst part, though, is that the costs of spam, as far as society goes, like lost productivity and fraud, are paid for by the general public and internet service providers who have to add extra capacity to cope with all the spam. Spam, in short, and those who propagate it, known as spammers, are truly the scourge of the earth. Enough with the negativity, though, because here's a recommendation. Today's recommendation is genuinely short and simple, and it's a first. The first poem, that is. Now, I'm normally not one for poems, and I'd understand if you aren't much for them either. They're usually very short, vague, and you gotta read them several times over to really get an inkling of what their meaning entails. They're almost the exact opposite of a story, which is descriptive, it draws you in. More times than not, it's a lot less vague. Still, this poem is one I hold dear to me. The poem is called When You Are Old by William Butler Yeats. From what I can tell, it's a poem about regrets in life and a past lover. But that's just my interpretation. I encourage you to read the very short poem yourself, links provided below, and to come up with your own interpretation of its meaning. Feel free to share it with me in the comments. That said, I'd say that's a wrap. Have a great weekend, and remember, if you find yourself in a bar full of street toughs, don't mess around with Jim. Just take my word on that one.
I'm a country boy, said I'm looking for a man named Jim. I am a pool shooting boy, my name is Willie McCoy, but down at home they call me Slim. Yeah, I'm looking for the king of 42nd Street, he drive on a drop-top Cadillac. Last week he took all my money and it may sound funny, but